Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. We are really thrilled to have you here with us today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. If you're tuning in, you are probably that person in your friend group who, you know, loves to look beneath the surface of things.
Right, exactly. You don't just want the headlines, you want to understand the actual machinery operating underneath those headlines.
You want the whole picture.
Yeah. And today we are looking at a piece of intellectual machinery that has fundamentally shaped the modern world.
Truly, fundamentally.
We are diving into a really comprehensive, multi-layered body of research. It's simply titled Feminism, a Critical Overview.
And feminism is obviously a topic we encounter constantly.
Constantly. I mean, it's in political debates, on social media, and corporate HR policies.
Pop culture everywhere.
Exactly. But our mission today is to unpack this not just as a laundry list of specific political issues.
Right, not just the wage gap or reproductive rights.
Yeah. We are looking at it as an entire worldview. Actually, the source material kicks off with a really striking quote by the activist and author Charlotte Bunch. She calls feminism a gestalt.
A Gestalt.
Yeah.
That's a powerful word to use there.
It is. It implies an all-encompassing way of perceiving reality. It's not just a political platform.
It's a lens through which you view everything.
So our goal today is to help you navigate this incredibly complex ideology. We want to understand where its roots actually lie, how it has evolved over centuries, and the wildly different branches it has grown into.
And they are very different branches, sometimes totally contradictory.
Because, as our sources point out right away, there isn't just one singular feminism.
There really isn't.
There are many feminisms, plural. They are shaped by entirely different cultures, economic realities, and history, even though they share a baseline commitment to equal treatment.
That distinction between a singular movement and a pluralistic worldview is, it's a really crucial place to start.
I think so, too.
To truly grasp that gestalt that Charlotte Bunch describes, we have to go much deeper than modern social media discourse. We have to look beneath the laws, beneath the economics, and examine the very foundation of human knowledge.
Which sounds intimidating, but it's fascinating.
It is. We have to look at how we perceive reality itself. To understand a movement that is primarily known for its social activism, we actually have to begin our journey in the realm of abstract philosophy.
Yeah, we have to look at the soil.
Exactly. If we don't understand the soil in which these ideas were planted, we can't possibly understand the tree that grew from it, or why its branches reach in the specific directions that they do.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this was the first major realization for me when going through our stack of sources today.
Yeah.
When you open a comprehensive document on feminism, you typically expect to see, I don't know, timelines of protest.
Or statistics on workplace equality.
Right. But this overview starts with metaphysics, literally the philosophical study of reality and existence.
It's a bold starting point.
It forces you to ask this question. Why does a critical overview of a social movement begin with abstract metaphysics?
It begins there because metaphysics is the starting point of all human knowledge, period.
It dictates the rules of the game.
Exactly. It dictates what we believe actually exists and what human life ultimately means.
Mm-hmm.
The documentation we are reviewing traces this really fascinating line of causality.
Walk us through that causality.
Okay, so once a society decides what kind of world we live in.
Like whether there's a God or not.
Right. Whether that is a universe governed by a divine creator, a universe of pure physical matter, or a reality built largely on social constructs. Once you decide that, society naturally begins to form its values.
It creates a moral compass based on that reality.
Yes. Those values become your sense of right and wrong, which philosophers call axiology or moral theory.
Okay, metaphysics leads to axiology.
And then from that moral theory, you start building your social systems. You write your laws, you structure your economics, and you define your politics.
So it trickles all the way down.
It does. So if you want to understand why feminist thinkers advocate for certain laws or social structures today, you have to trace those demands all the way back up the ladder to their core view of reality.
It's the quiet power of metaphysics.
It shapes everything, even when the general public has absolutely no idea it's happening.
It's like trying to understand the strategies of a game without knowing what board you're playing on.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, the sources outline three main metaphysical views that exist within the broader feminist worldview. But the primary one, the mainstream foundation for most modern feminist theory, is built on existentialism.
Yes.
And to explain this, the research uses a really brilliant analogy involving a pair of scissors.
I love this analogy.
Right. Okay, so think of a standard pair of scissors. It was designed with a specific purpose in mind, cutting material.
That is its essence.
Exactly. The idea of cutting that essence existed in the inventor's mind long before the physical metal and plastic were ever manufactured.
The concept predates the object.
So for the scissors, their essence came before their existence.
And that analogy brings us right to the absolute heart of the mainstream feminist existentialist position, which it draws incredibly heavily on the mid-20th century philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre.
What does Sartre do with the scissors?
Sartre essentially flips that scissor analogy on its head when it comes to human beings.
Okay.
The logic flows like this. If you operate from a secular standpoint, and you believe there is no grand designer in the sky creating humans for a specific preordained purpose,
Then we aren't like the scissors.
we are fundamentally not like the scissors. We were not made with an essence already programmed into our hardware.
Just here.
Exactly. Therefore, for human beings, our existence precedes our essence. We simply pop into existence first, as conscious beings in a universe without inherent predetermined meaning.
Which sounds a bit bleak at first.
It can. But because we have no predefined essence, we are entirely free. In fact, Sartre says we are condemned to be free. We are forced to create our own purpose for ourselves.
It's a massive philosophical leap. You go from there is no divine blueprint to we are completely free to define ourselves.
It changes everything.
But how does that translate from, a Parisian cafe in the 1940s into modern feminism? Like, what is the real-world impact of saying existence precedes essence?
The implication is earth-shattering for the structure of society.
How so?
If human beings do not have an inherent, biologically or divinely mandated essence, then there is no natural, universal rule book that dictates how men and women must behave.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. There is no cosmic law stating that men must act aggressively and dominate the public sphere, or that women must act passively and remain in the domestic sphere.
So all of that is just made up.
According to this view, yes.
Yeah.
Everything we think of as gender roles ceases to be an unchangeable fact of nature. Instead, gender becomes a social construct.
It's something society invented.
Invented, codified over centuries, and relentlessly enforced. And the deeply empowering realization for the existentialist feminist is that if society constructed these roles, society can deconstruct them.
That is huge.
It's the engine driving a vast majority of modern feminist thought, that metaphysical belief that reality and gender are socially constructed rather than naturally mandated.
It completely levels the playing field. It basically tells you that the walls keeping you in aren't made of stone. They are made of ideas, and ideas can be changed.
Exactly.
But to be fair to the scope of the document, the sources do point out that this existentialist, atheistic view is not the only metaphysical starting point for feminists. There are two other conceptions of reality that the text explores.
Yes, the movement is definitely not philosophically monolithic.
So what's the second view?
The second perspective is held by those who do believe in God and a divine order.
Okay, so they reject the existentialist premise entirely.
Right. But they argue that traditional religious interpretations of human purpose have been deeply corrupted by patriarchal systems over thousands of years.
So the message got scrambled by the messengers.
Exactly. In this view, the sacred texts and religious traditions need radical reinterpretation because their current forms reflect historical male power dynamics, not actual divine truth.
It's a reformist approach to theology.
Precisely. And the third view mentioned is essentially a pragmatic one.
Which just skips the philosophy altogether.
Pretty much. It simply shrugs off the metaphysical debate entirely. A pragmatic feminist might just say, listen, we don't need to resolve the origins of the universe to recognize that women deserve equal pay, bodily autonomy, and safety today. Let's just focus on the material reality of the present.
I can appreciate that pragmatism, but regardless of which metaphysical starting point a theorist takes, they inevitably have to confront the next major philosophical hurdle mapped out in our sources.
Which is epistemology.
Yes, epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, how we know what we know, and critically, whose knowledge is considered valid.
That whose knowledge part is key.
The text points out that feminist thinkers look back at the history of traditional Western philosophy and see a massive systemic problem.
A glaring one.
They don't view traditional philosophy as this unbroken chain of objective truth. They view it as a distinctly masculine body of theoretical concepts.
Right, because look at who was writing it.
Exactly. They argue it is fundamentally built on patriarchal constructs and often steeped in social misogyny. They describe traditional philosophy as a phallocentric strategy.
meaning it centers the male perspective as the universal human perspective.
Historically, this has resulted in defining women in negative ways, or misrepresenting their capabilities, or just rendering them entirely subservient and invisible in the realm of serious intellectual thought.
The epistemological critique is one of the most fascinating layers of this entire overview, because it asks us to question the very measuring stick we use for truth.
The Lorraine Code stuff here blew my mind.
Yes. The sources highlight the work of feminist epistemologist Lorraine Code. She makes this profound observation about what Western society considers the ideal knower.
Right, like the archetypal intellectual.
Think about our cultural archetype of a reliable, trustworthy scientist or philosopher. Code points out that this ideal knower looks suspiciously identical to the traditional idealized male.
The traits map perfectly onto each other.
The ideal knower is supposed to be purely rational, completely objective, detached, and utterly unemotional.
And here's where the trap snaps shut.
Yeah.
If society defines good, valid knowledge as unemotional and detached, and simultaneously that same society defines women as naturally emotional, subjective, and attached,
Then society has conveniently excluded women's knowledge claims right out of the gate.
it is a totally rigged game. Before a woman even speaks, her perspective is culturally coded as less reliable simply because of the style of delivery that society expects from her.
You are hitting the nail on the head. That is the exact mechanism of exclusion. If the criteria for being taken seriously are inherently coded as masculine traits, then feminine perspectives are dismissed.
Not because the ideas are bad.
Right, but based on their failure to conform to a male epistemological standard.
That is wild to think about.
And this leads directly into the third philosophical pillar covered in our sources, which is axiology, or the study of values and moral theory.
Okay, from knowledge to morality.
Just as feminists challenge how knowledge is defined, they deeply challenge how morality is defined. The documentation dives into the work of Carol Gilligan, a prominent feminist ethicist.
And she introduced the concept of care-based ethics.
Yes, she did.
I found Gilligan's work really compelling. To understand it, you have to look at what she was pushing against.
Which was the traditional moral philosophy of the time.
Right, which, again, was almost exclusively written by men. And it focused heavily on an ethics of rights and justice.
Very analytical.
It's very Kantian. It's about abstract rules, fairness, individual autonomy. It's about balancing competing legal claims between independent people who don't necessarily know or care about each other.
It's a mathematical way to view morality.
Gilligan argued that women, due to their socialization and historical roles, often approach morality quite differently. She proposed an ethics of care.
Which emphasizes relationships over rules.
Exactly. Empathy, context, the maintenance of social bonds. It asks not what is the abstract rule here, but how do we maintain the web of relationships in this specific situation?
It sounds like a beautiful counterbalance to a rigid rules-based society.
It does.
However, what makes this critical overview so robust is that it doesn't just present Gilligan's theory as undisputed fact. It explores the intense critique of that theory from within the feminist movement itself.
Yeah, the pushback was fierce.
Some feminist philosophers look at this care-centered ethic and raise a massive red flag.
They ask a deeply uncomfortable question.
They ask, did women freely choose to be the empathetic, caring, self-sacrificing moral agents? Or did this specific brand of morality arise simply as a survival mechanism to serve the needs of a patriarchal society?
Because, as the text rather pointedly notes, men would hardly object to a moral philosophy that encourages women to be dedicated, caring attendants.
Attendants who prioritize the needs of others over themselves. It serves the dominant group perfectly.
Right. It forces you to ask whether we are celebrating a genuine female virtue or if we are just romantically rebranding the unpaid emotional labor that society has always demanded of women.
Are we calling it ethics when it's really just conditioning?
That is such a sharp critique.
That is the absolute crux of the debate. Some feminist political philosophers argue that women actually desperately need that traditional male-coded ethics of rights and justice to protect themselves.
Right.
Because if you are a marginalized group navigating powerful social institutions, empathy and care might not save you.
A landlord doesn't care about empathy when the rent is due.
Exactly. You need hard objective rules, legal rights, and abstract justice to ensure you are treated equally when you are at a systemic disadvantage.
It demonstrates that even within the highest levels of feminist theory, there is rigorous, ongoing debate about what values actually serve the goal of liberation.
It's not a monolith.
This historical context naturally leads us into how these ideas manifested in actual society and how the categories of man and woman were constructed over time.
Yes, moving from philosophy to history.
And this brings us to a quote from Simone de Beauvoir that serves as a cornerstone for this entire worldview. She wrote, "Representation of the world is the work of men. They describe it from their own point of view, which they confuse with absolute truth."
It's a devastating quote.
The sources map out exactly how this dynamic played out historically. For centuries, the people who had the institutional power to write about human nature, the philosophers, scientists, theologians, lawmakers,
They are almost exclusively men.
because they were men, they naturally and perhaps unconsciously took maleness as the universal standard.
They looked in the mirror to define humanity.
Exactly. And therefore, women were defined not by what they independently are, but by how they differ from that male standard.
The conceptual outcome of that is incredibly simple but damaging.
Man is defined as the default human being. Woman is defined merely as the female deviation from that norm.
That historical trajectory perfectly encapsulates Simone de Beauvoir's groundbreaking theory from her 1949 masterpiece, The Second Sex.
Let's talk about the second sex.
De Beauvoir starts her massive inquiry with a deceptively simple question. What is a woman?
Seems simple enough.
But as she sifts through human history, literature, and biology, she realizes that women have never been allowed to define themselves. They have always been defined in relation to men.
Man is the subject.
Yes, man is the subject. He's the absolute, the essential being who acts upon the world. Woman is what de Beauvoir calls the other.
Capital O, other.
Capital O. She is the incidental, the inessential, the object. Society sets up the male as the default setting of existence, and woman exists only as man decrees her to be.
What I really appreciate about de Beauvoir's approach, as highlighted in the research, is that she didn't just sit in an armchair and make sweeping philosophical claims.
No, she did the rigorous homework.
The sources detail how she spent the entire first volume of The Second Sex exploring biology, Freudian psychology, and historical materialism.
Which is essentially the Marxist idea that material and economic conditions dictate how society is structured.
Right. She was actively searching for some inherent, unarguable reason for women's historical subordination.
Did you find one?
Her conclusion was that there is no absolute justification. Yes, she recognized undeniable biological realities, puberty, menstruation, pregnancy, the physical toll of reproduction.
You can't ignore those.
But she flatly denied that these biological facts establish a fixed and inevitable social destiny for women. Biology, in her view, is a physical reality, but it is not a life sentence to second-class citizenship.
Precisely. If biology isn't the root cause of women's oppression, then we have to look at the cultural and social environment.
We have to look at the cage.
Exactly. The documentation outlines de Beauvoir's conclusions regarding the true roots of this subordination. First, women are conditioned from the moment they are born to be dependent objects rather than active subjects.
They're taught to be looked at.
To be looked at, to be acted upon, rather than to take action and assert their own will. Second, they have historically been compelled to live unfulfilling lives, restricted almost entirely to the domestic sphere.
Cut off from the broader economic and intellectual world.
And third, they are forced to accept a profound loss of autonomy. The ultimate tragedy of this system, according to de Beauvoir, is that a woman eventually internalizes this otherness.
She starts to believe it.
She begins to see herself and make her life choices, not in accordance with her own unique potential, but exactly through the lens of how men have defined her. She becomes complicit in her own objectification because she knows no other way to exist.
That internalization creates a psychological pressure cooker, which leads directly to a phenomenon that emerged prominently in the mid-20th century.
Betty Friedan.
Yes. The sources, drawing on the work of Betty Friedan, call this the problem that has no name. It describes a deep, pervasive, and largely unspoken sense of discontent among women, particularly middle-class housewives in the 1950s and 60s.
The post-war era.
Their research provides a comprehensive look at the various societal forces that fed into this malaise. It was like a perfect storm of psychological suppression.
It really was a multifaceted system of control. The sources identify several key drivers of this discontent. First, you have the profound influence of Freudian psychoanalysis during that era.
Freud has a lot to answer for here.
The feminist critique argues that Freud's theories fundamentally infantilize women. Concepts like penis envy or diagnosing women's frustrations as hysteria.
Which literally comes from the Greek word for uterus.
Right. It essentially treated women as psychologically stunted or inherently defective compared to men. Instead of looking at a woman's unhappiness as a logical reaction to a restrictive society, psychoanalysis told her that her unhappiness was a personal biological neurosis.
It's a classic gaslighting technique. You're not oppressed, you're just crazy.
Then you add the media landscape of the time. You had an explosion of post-war women's magazines pushing endless, glossy images of the happy housewife.
Selling the dream.
They were idealizing a very narrow, domestic version of womanhood as the ultimate and only path to fulfillment. And backing up that media narrative was the academic world, specifically the sociological theory of functionalism.
I remember reading about functionalism in college.
Functionalism, particularly the work of sociologists like Talcott Parsons, argued that for society to function smoothly, it needed a strict division of labor.
It needs gears.
Yes. Men were assigned the instrumental role going out into the public sphere, competing, and earning money. Women were assigned the expressive role, staying home, managing emotions, raising children, and providing a stable haven.
This theory didn't just describe society, it prescribed it. It reduced women's potential entirely to their biological and caretaking functions for the supposed good of the social order.
Combine that academic and media pressure with the systematic denial of professional careers, where women were routinely fired when they got married or pregnant.
Which is just unfathomable today.
And an education system that explicitly tracked boys into the sciences and business while tracking girls into home economics and secretarial work.
All of these forces bore down simultaneously to create this suffocating discontent that Frieden identified. It was a societal architecture designed to keep women in a very specific, limited space.
But how does a society maintain that architecture so effectively without needing to use constant explicit force?
That is the million-dollar question. To explain that, the documentation turns to the theories of modern philosopher Judith Butler.
Butler's work is incredibly influential.
Her concept of the gender binary as a repeated act is foundational to contemporary feminist theory. The research breaks down her premise, which starts with the idea that society operates on a strict regulatory framework. This framework demands and enforces heterosexuality as the default, natural baseline of human existence. And to maintain that framework, society requires the absolute assumption that there are only two distinct, opposite, and complementary genders, male and female.
Butler's genius is in explaining how that binary is maintained. It isn't just a passive fact of biology. It is actively maintained through performance.
What does she mean by performance?
Every single day, we engage in acts. Our clothing choices, our grooming habits, our speech patterns, our body language. Every time a little girl is praised for sitting quietly with her legs crossed, or a little boy is scolded with "boys don't cry."
Those are the acts maintaining the binary.
Exactly. Crucially, Butler points out that acts which do not comply with the norms of this binary are swiftly punished by society. That punishment is the enforcement mechanism.
It keeps people in line.
It could be subtle, like social ostracization or mockery. Or it could be explicit and severe, like job loss or physical violence against those who step out of line.
The psychological mechanism at play here is fascinating. Because this framework is enforced so strictly from birth, individuals continuously and unconsciously repeat these gender acts over their entire lifetime.
We perform them on a loop.
It becomes a performance that we don't even realize we are executing. We think we are just being ourselves, when really we are reading from a script.
And the ultimate trick of this system, as highlighted in the sources, is that this constant, lifelong collective repetition creates a false impression.
It makes the gender binary look fixed, natural, and biologically inevitable.
We perform the construct so often and so universally that we mistake the societal script for the fundamental laws of physics.
It is a profound realization. Once you understand Butler's performativity, you start looking at human history not as a steady march of natural progression, but as a series of enforced scripts.
You see the matrix.
You really do. And that realization brings us to the historical evolution of the feminist movement itself, which the sources divide into 4 distinct waves.
But before we get to the waves, the research highlights a fascinating historical paradox that ignited the entire struggle.
Right. Let's rewind to the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Here's where it gets really interesting.
The Enlightenment is usually taught as this era of incredible intellectual awakening. It promoted egalitarian principles, the value of the individual, and the revolutionary idea that humans possess inherent natural rights simply by being born.
These were the philosophical ideas that sparked massive uprisings. The American and French revolutions, seeking to overthrow the divine right of kings and the rigid old aristocratic orders.
In France, they drafted the famous Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, boldly stating that men are born and remain free and equal in rights.
It sounds like the dawn of universal freedom.
It sounds like universal freedom until you read the fine print.
Right.
The paradox highlighted in the text is that the codification of these glorious new rights was strictly and intentionally reserved for men.
Wait, really? Intentionally?
Yes. The philosophers of the Enlightenment, like Rousseau, argued passionately for male citizenship, but still believed women were naturally suited only for domestic subordination.
Yeah, that is quite the double standard.
By formally defining rights and citizenship in this exclusionary way, the Enlightenment actually institutionalized greater inequality for women. They suddenly found themselves legally locked out of the new democratic order.
They were explicitly excluded from the new definitions of freedom.
Exactly.
And that glaring hypocrisy is what prompted the earliest feminist thinkers to act. The sources mention Olympe de Gouges in France, who took the revolutionaries' own document and rewrote it as the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the Female Citizen.
A brilliant move.
She essentially held up a mirror to the new republic and said, if all humans are born free and equal and possess the capacity for reason, that must include women.
She demanded that women be given the same political rights, including the right to vote and hold office.
Tragically, her radical demands led to her execution by guillotine during the Reign of Terror.
It was incredibly dangerous work.
But her work, and the work of others like her, provided the spark that eventually ignited organized feminist movements.
Which brings us to the concept of the waves of feminism. The wave metaphor is incredibly useful because it illustrates how feminist concerns evolved.
As one wave crashes, another forms behind it.
As successive generations won new freedoms and crested a wave, they inevitably crashed onto the shore of entirely new social problems, requiring a new wave to form. Let's trace this timeline.
Okay, first wave.
The first wave emerges in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is crucial to note that this wave didn't happen in a vacuum. It was deeply intertwined with broader social reform movements of the era,
Like abolition.
particularly the abolition of slavery and the temperance movement. The focus of the first waves was foundational, securing fundamental legal rights that women were denied under systems like coverture.
Coverture is wild to think about now. That's where a woman's legal rights and property were entirely subsumed by her husband upon marriage.
She essentially ceased to exist legally.
The first wave was about fighting for the right to exist as a legal entity. They were fighting for the right to own property, the right to pursue higher education, and most famously, the right to vote women's suffrage.
The prominent figures here laid the intellectual groundwork for everything that followed. You have Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman way back in 1792.
She argued fiercely against the Enlightenment thinkers who claimed women were naturally inferior.
She stated that women only appeared inferior because they were systematically denied access to education. If you educate women, she argued, you will see they possess the exact same capacity for reason as men.
Alongside Wollstonecraft, you have powerful advocates like Sojourner Truth. The sources highlight her, and it's vital we discuss her impact.
Absolutely.
Sojourner Truth was a formerly enslaved African-American abolitionist. Her famous 1851 speech, often remembered by the refrain, "Ain't I a woman?" was revolutionary.
She challenged everything.
She stood before an audience and directly challenged the prevailing fragile notion of womanhood that was exclusively reserved for delicate, wealthy, white women.
By pointing to her own life, the grueling physical labor she endured, the pain of having her children sold away, she shattered the illusion that women were inherently weak and needed male protection.
She highlighted the intersection of race, class, and gender long before the academic term intersectionality ever existed.
Fast forward a few decades, past the achievement of suffrage, and we hit the second wave. This wave crashes ashore roughly between the 1960s and the 1980s.
The first wave got women the right to vote, but the second wave theorists looked around and realized that the vote wasn't enough if society still kept you economically dependent.
And locked in the domestic sphere.
Right. They expanded the battlefield beyond basic legalities to tackle broader social, cultural, and economic inequalities. This is the era of fighting for Title IXs and workplace equality.
Demanding fair hiring practices, equal pay, and the chance for promotion.
The second wave was profoundly disruptive to the private sphere as well. They argued that the personal is political.
They fought for reproductive rights, including the legalization of contraception and abortion, arguing that without bodily autonomy, Economic autonomy was impossible.
They challenged the traditional homemaker roles that Betty Friedan had critiqued. Critically, this wave also started raising serious public awareness about issues that had previously been hidden behind closed doors.
Domestic violence, marital rape, and sexual harassment in the workplace.
They dragged these issues out of the private sphere and demanded public legal accountability. Key figures driving this era include Friedan, whose book The Feminine Mystique we discussed, and Simone de Beauvoir, whose existentialist theories provided the framework.
But every movement has its blind spots, and the second wave was no exception. This leads directly to the emergence of the third wave, which took shape in the 1990s and continued into the early 2000s.
The third wave arose largely as a direct critique of the perceived limitations and exclusions of the second wave.
The primary argument was that the second wave often presented a unified, universal idea of womanhood and women's struggles that really only reflected the specific experiences and priorities of middle-class, white, Western women.
The third wave sought to shatter that universalist assumption.
The defining concept of this era is intersectionality, the understanding that different aspects of a person's identity, such as race, class, gender identity, and sexual orientation, do not exist separately.
They intersect and overlap to create entirely unique experiences of both systemic oppression and privilege.
The third wave was about embracing diversity, contradiction, and individuality. It aimed to center the voices of women of color, LGBTQ+ individuals, working-class women, and other marginalized groups who felt deeply alienated by the mainstream leadership of the earlier movements.
It was also an era characterized by a heavy engagement with media and pop culture. Think of the Riot Girl punk movement or the reclaiming of derogatory language.
Third-wave feminists celebrated strong, complex female characters and sought to reclaim sexual agency on their own terms, rejecting the second wave's sometimes rigid views on sex and pornography.
We see figures like Rebecca Walker, who actually coined the term third-wave feminism in 1992 in response to the Anita Hill hearings, and Judith Butler, whose theories on gender performativity deeply influenced how this generation understood identity.
That evolutionary process continues right into the present day with the fourth wave, which our sources note began crystallizing around 2012.
If the previous waves were defined by printed manifestos, television broadcasts, and academic theory, the fourth wave is fundamentally defined by the internet.
It is the era of digital activism.
The core goals remain heavily focused on intersectionality, but the digital landscape has shifted the tactics. There is a massive new emphasis on body positivity, challenging the unrealistic beauty standards perpetuated by social media algorithms.
And a fierce, globally connected pushback against ongoing issues of sexual harassment, assault, and workplace misogyny.
The fourth wave also features a deep focus on gender-neutral language and trans-inclusive discourse. Figures like the actor Emma Watson and the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie become prominent voices, leveraging their massive global platforms.
And nothing exemplifies the sheer power and speed of the fourth wave quite like the #MeToo movement.
The sources provide a really striking timeline of how this digital activism unfolded and shook the foundations of global power structures.
What's crucial to understand is that it didn't happen overnight. It was a concept that simmered before the technology allowed it to explode.
The timeline notes that way back in 2006, civil rights activist Tarana Burke coined the phrase "Me Too" to raise awareness of sexual abuse and assault, specifically focusing on women of color in underprivileged communities who lacked resources.
It existed as a grassroots community effort for over a decade.
Then the catalyst hit in 2017. The explosive sexual abuse and coercion allegations against the massively powerful American film producer Harvey Weinstein broke in the New York Times.
The dam cracked.
Almost immediately after that article, actor Alyssa Milano sent a viral tweet suggesting that if all women who had been sexually harassed or assaulted simply replied, "Me too," it might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem.
The floodgates completely opened. Millions of women across the world from all walks of life responded.
The timeline shows this singular digital moment leading to an avalanche of women coming forward to accuse powerful men across all industries: media, politics, tech, finance.
And by early 2018, you see the visual manifestation of this digital movement, with women in the film industry wearing black to the Golden Globe Awards as a unified, highly visible show of solidarity.
It perfectly demonstrates how a foundational feminist concept can lie dormant and then be ignited into a global reckoning by the hyperconnectivity of the fourth wave.
It is a powerful demonstration of how the method of the movement has changed, even as the core struggle for bodily autonomy remains. But as the movement has grown massive and global, it is also naturally splintered.
Just as there are different historical waves, there are profoundly different theoretical branches. The sources identify several distinct types of feminism.
And understanding the friction between them is crucial because they often fiercely disagree on both the root cause of women's oppression and the necessary solutions.
Let's start with the two heavyweights that often clash in the public sphere: liberal feminism versus radical feminism.
Let's define liberal feminism first.
Liberal feminism is described in the text as the earliest and perhaps most mainstream form of feminist theory today. Its core philosophical belief is rooted in classical liberalism, the absolute value of individual autonomy and equality of opportunity for all humans.
Liberal feminists operate primarily in the public sphere. They want to work within the existing systems of society to enact change.
They focus on lobbying to change restrictive laws, eliminating discriminatory barriers in the corporate workplace, and ensuring women have a fair, equal shot within the current economic and political structure.
Essentially, they want a bigger, equal piece of the pie.
That is the goal. But the critique of liberal feminism, as noted in the text, is severe.
Very severe. Critics argue that liberal feminism is inherently a white, middle-class, Western movement. By focusing so heavily on breaking corporate glass ceilings and achieving individual professional success, it fails to adequately address the much deeper, systemic, and life-threatening needs of minority, working class, and non-Western women.
Women who are facing hurdles far larger than unequal pay in a boardroom. Liberal feminism, the critique goes, only works for women who already have a certain baseline of privilege.
And that critique is largely where radical feminism steps in.
Radical feminists look at the liberal approach of passing laws and climbing corporate ladders and say, you are just treating the symptoms, not the underlying disease.
Radical feminism identifies the entire system of patriarchy itself as the root cause of women's subordination globally. They don't just want an equal piece of the pie. They believe the recipe is poisoned.
And they want to throw it out entirely and rebuild society from the ground up.
Their focus is deeply personal, cultural, and structural. They focus heavily on women's reproduction, the policing of women's sexuality, and the aggressive societal construction of the feminine ideal.
They argue that drastic, revolutionary steps must be taken to change the foundational cultural attitudes that foster rape, domestic violence, and the general contempt for women that occurs when they are culturally reduced to their sexual utility.
Because of this focus on the cultural roots of violence, radical feminists often directly target phenomena like mainstream advertising and pornography.
Which they argue fundamentally treat women merely as sexualized objects for male consumption. The research outlines the radical anti-pornography argument, championed by thinkers like Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon, as a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle.
Consider the trajectory of their argument. The cycle begins with viewers consuming mass-market pornography. The argument states that, over time, viewers need to see increasingly more extreme or violent pornography in order to achieve the same level of arousal.
As they consume more of this extreme content, the viewers become psychologically desensitized to the violent imagery.
And the cycle continues downward. Because there is a market demand for this extreme content, the women performing in pornography are subjected to increasingly brutalized or coercive conditions.
The result of this mass consumption is that the physical and psychological subordination of women becomes normalized and heavily eroticized on a societal scale.
And the final tragic conclusion of this radical argument is that this widespread cultural eroticization of subordination ultimately facilitates, promotes, and excuses actual real-world violence towards women in everyday life.
It is a deeply critical look at how the media we consume directly impacts the physical safety of marginalized groups.
It's a stark contrast to how a liberal feminist might view the same issue. A liberal feminist might argue from a standpoint of individual autonomy, asserting that a woman has the individual right to participate in sex work or pornography, and the focus should be on labor rights and safety.
Radical feminists reject that entirely, viewing the industry as an irredeemable systemic tool of patriarchal control.
Now, if we shift our lens away from culture and focus strictly on economics, the sources introduce us to Marxist or socialist feminism.
This branch combines classical Marxist economic principles with radical feminist perspectives on gender. For a Marxist feminist, you cannot possibly understand gender oppression without understanding capitalism.
The economic lens they apply here is fascinating because it reframes something deeply personal, having children as an economic function.
The research walks through a Marxist flowchart. It starts with the ruling class, the bourgeoisie. The wealthy men who control capital see children essentially as a future labor force.
Cheap instruments of labor from which they can profit to maintain their wealth.
Therefore, the capitalist system requires women to constantly produce children to supply this unending demand for future workers.
The text literally states that socialist feminists regard the bearing and raising of children as forms of productive activity.
It views motherhood not just as a biological or emotional state, but as massive amounts of unpaid labor that essentially subsidizes and props up the entire capitalist system.
Exactly. If women were paid an hourly wage for the labor of producing and raising the next generation of workers, the capitalist system would collapse.
The analysis concludes that women are therefore oppressed not just by patriarchy, but specifically by their husbands within the structure of the nuclear family.
The husband benefits from exploiting the unpaid domestic labor of his wife, which allows him to go sell his own labor in the public market.
In this incredibly harsh economic lens, the Marxist feminist argues that the bourgeois man sees his wife merely as an instrument of production.
In their view, the oppression of women is inextricably intertwined with class struggle and capitalist exploitation. You simply cannot dismantle patriarchy without simultaneously dismantling capitalism.
That is a wildly different battlefield than the liberal feminists fighting for equal pay at a Fortune 500 company.
Very different. And this fracturing of perspectives becomes even more pronounced and vital to understand when we look at Black feminism and womanism.
The sources emphasize that Black feminism is a distinct intellectual tradition born out of the specific historical necessity of Black women in America.
Black feminist theorists argue that they face a unique, simultaneous dual oppression, both gender and race. Furthermore, severe class issues intersect with both of those.
Because of this, Black feminists explicitly do not identify with the universal label of a shared women's experience of oppression.
They point out the undeniable reality that a wealthy white woman's experience of navigating gender inequality is fundamentally different from a poor Black woman's experience of navigating racism, sexism, and poverty all at exactly the same time.
To illustrate this historical reality, the documentation uses an analogy of a running track. Imagine a timeline of rights laid out like a race: gaining citizenship, securing the right to vote, achieving employment rights, gaining sexual freedom, and securing reproductive rights.
On this historical track, you have two runners. The middle-class white woman is positioned far ahead, crossing the milestones of citizenship and the vote relatively early in the 20th century.
But the working-class Black woman is placed miles behind at the starting line, held back by Jim Crow laws, systemic poverty, and explicit racial violence.
The text notes a painful truth. By the 1980s, while women of color could legally vote, many areas of mainstream feminist protests, like fighting for executive workplace rights or access to birth control, were still driven almost entirely by the priorities of middle-class white women.
This often left the specific, urgent struggles of Black women completely unaddressed. Racism and class prejudice didn't just exist outside the movement, they existed deep within the feminist movement itself.
To address this exclusion, brilliant figures like the author Alice Walker developed the concept of womanism.
The sources describe womanism using the metaphor of a garden. Imagine a watering can labeled womanism pouring water onto a diverse row of blooming flowers.
The water droplets represent the core, uncompromising tenets of womanism: the absolute renunciation of class divisions, the promotion of gender equality, the freedom of sexuality, and the fierce, total rejection of racism.
The central idea is that in Alice Walker's garden of womanism, all people, men and women alike, must thrive equally, regardless of race, gender, or class.
It is a much more holistic, community-focused, and spiritually grounded approach compared to the highly individualistic focus of mainstream liberal feminism.
Womanism is an excellent example of applied intersectionality. And expanding that intersectional lens leads us directly into the global perspectives and modern battlegrounds covered in the research.
If we are critically examining how Western feminism has historically overlooked marginalized groups within its own borders, we absolutely must examine how it views the rest of the world.
The document spends significant time analyzing the pervasive stereotype of the third world woman.
This part of the research is incredibly vital. The sources highlight how Western feminist literature and media often unconsciously apply a very specific, damaging set of labels to real women living in developing nations.
These labels portray them universally as marginalized, entirely restricted to the domestic sphere: poor, overly religious, illiterate, victims of masculine control, oppressed by their traditional cultures, and fundamentally powerless and vulnerable.
It is essentially a laundry list of every tragic stereotype imaginable. Theorists like Chandra Talpade Mohanty have offered devastating critiques of this practice.
The text points out that this Western perception is deeply flawed and colonial in nature because it reduces billions of incredibly diverse, resilient, and active women into a uniform, unchanging, and oppressed monolith.
It completely strips them of their historical context and their agency. The sources specifically highlight the political strategies of indigenous women in Latin America as a powerful counterexample to this Western narrative.
Indigenous women suffer severe inequalities based on both their gender and their ethnicity, another profound form of dual oppression.
But rather than just adopting imported Western feminist tactics, which often focus solely on the individual woman, their strategy is to deeply embed themselves and increase their leadership role within their own ethnic struggles.
They bring women's issues to the forefront from within their communities. They explicitly link female autonomy with ethnic autonomy.
They realize the profound truth that they cannot possibly fight for their rights as women without simultaneously fighting for the survival, land rights, and cultural rights of their entire people. The two battles are completely intertwined.
That global lens is absolutely necessary to avoid a narrow, Western-centric view of liberation. However, the document also returns its focus to the modern West to highlight ongoing cultural critiques, particularly a concept popularized by Naomi Wolf known as the beauty myth.
The argument presented here is that even as women in the West have successfully fought for and gained unprecedented legal, educational, and economic freedoms over the last few decades, society has instituted a new, insidious form of control to replace the old ones.
It controls women through impossible, constantly shifting physical standards.
The sources describe this as a literal prison that women are conditioned to build for themselves. The argument is that women are kept occupied, financially drained, and psychologically insecure by being locked into an unending pursuit of the beauty myth.
Think of the massive amounts of time, energy, and money spent on the cosmetics industry, obsessive diet culture, punishing exercise regimens, and increasingly normalized cosmetic surgery.
As the legal chains fell away, the psychological chains of physical perfection took their place, ensuring women remained distracted and self-critical rather than wielding their new economic power fully.
It is a profound critique of consumer culture and its role in maintaining gendered insecurity. Another highly active and frankly often contentious modern battleground highlighted in the sources is the transgender coalition.
The document explores this complex landscape through the work of Julia Serrano, a prominent biologist, trans activist, and writer.
The research maps out the current state of division within feminist spaces. On one side, you have some cisgender feminists, meaning women whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth, who sometimes seek to exclude trans women from feminist spaces.
Their argument often relies on the idea that because trans women did not experience female socialization and biological realities from birth, they cannot truly understand or represent the core struggles of womanhood.
And on the other side of that division, you have the reality that trans women suffer horrific rates of transphobic violence and misogynistic attacks.
Their expressions of femininity are routinely ridiculed, policed, and violently rejected by both patriarchal structures and sometimes even by cisgender women. It is a deeply fractured landscape.
It is fractured, but Serrano's work advocates for a powerful path forward through coalition.
Her theory posits that while all women, cisgender and transgender, have vastly different individual experiences in biology, their experiences of facing patriarchal standards and misogyny overlap significantly.
Both groups are punished by a society that inherently devalues the feminine.
Therefore, cisgender feminists and trans women can and should support each other in combating these attacks. The core unifying philosophy she proposes is the radical belief that femininity is masculinity's equal, just as women are men's equal.
It is a call for broad solidarity against a shared cultural devaluation of femininity, regardless of the biology of the person expressing it.
Shifting gears from identity to something that shapes our very thoughts, the sources delve into an incredibly fascinating concept regarding language.
We touched on epistemology earlier, how we define truth, but this goes down to the granular level of the actual words and grammar we use to communicate.
The concept is called écriture féminine, or feminine writing, pioneered by French theorists like Hélène Cixous.
The core argument here is that traditional language itself is not neutral. It reflects traditional male power structures.
Because men have historically controlled literature, academia, and publishing, the very structure of our language is patriarchal.
To combat this, women are urged to create a new écriture féminine, a new way of writing and speaking that forces the female experience into the text by her own rules, which they argue will lead to profound social change.
The comparison the sources make between sex, power, and language is quite profound. It posits two entirely different modes of expression.
The traditional male expression is described as a narrative that leads linearly to a specific goal. It is strictly logical, hierarchical, and structured.
It uses language that is phallocentric, meaning it entrenches a male point of view as the universal standard, and it has a vocabulary to effectively describe male pleasure, male ambition, and male experience.
In stark contrast, the theorists of écriture feminine describe female expression as inherently circular, centering on the ongoing experience itself rather than a final, conquerable goal.
I love that idea of expression being circular and experiential versus linear and goal-oriented. It explains so many fundamental communication disconnects.
The text suggests that female expression operates sometimes beyond strict linear logic. It is constantly searching for new language, new metaphors, and new perspectives, because the current linguistic tools provided by the patriarchy are simply inadequate.
The argument is that traditional language cannot yet accurately describe the nuances of female pleasure, the depths of the female psychological experience, or the fluid nature of female identity.
It is a radical push to reinvent the very tools of human communication.
It is an ambitious project, attempting to rewrite the code of human thought. Now, the final major modern battleground our sources cover in this segment brings us back to the realm of law and biology, abortion rights.
The document provides a very concise, rapid-fire mapping of the core legal and ethical arguments deployed by the feminist movement in support of the legalization of abortion.
Yes, the research distills decades of legal battles into several key pillars. First, there's the medical argument.
That access to safe abortion fundamentally protects women mentally and physically from the severe risks of forced pregnancy.
Second, there is the argument of equal bodily autonomy, that a woman must have the exact same rights to govern her own body as men do.
Since men obviously do not experience the physical, life-altering risks of pregnancy, forcing women to endure them creates a fundamental legal inequality.
Third, the legal argument centers on a woman's fundamental right to privacy in her medical decisions, free from government intrusion.
Fourth, the absolute assertion that a woman's body and her reproductive choices are entirely her own property to manage.
Fifth, from a constitutional standpoint, only a profoundly compelling state interest could ever justify regulating that bodily autonomy.
And finally, the ethical and legal argument that personhood, and therefore constitutional rights, is not legally recognized until a fetus reaches the point of viability outside the womb.
It is a very clear distillation of how liberal feminist arguments regarding legal privacy merge with radical feminist arguments regarding absolute bodily autonomy.
Now, as we transition into the final portions of our research, the document shifts significantly in tone. We move from abstract philosophy, historical timelines, and legal battlegrounds to something deeply personal and intimate.
The sources highlight a modern text called A Feminist Manifesto in 15 Suggestions by the acclaimed Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
What's beautiful about this text is its origin. It started simply as a personal email to a friend who asked for advice on how to raise her baby daughter as a feminist, which Adichie later expanded into a widely read book.
I found this section so warm and practical after hours of heavy academic philosophy. It brings all the theory we've discussed right down to the reality of the living room and the nursery.
The research lists several of her 15 suggestions, and a few really stand out as brilliant syntheses of feminist thought. First, she tells her friend, be a full person. Motherhood is a glorious gift, but do not define yourself solely by motherhood.
This is a direct, practical attack on that suffocating functionalist theory we discussed earlier, which tried to reduce women entirely to their expressive child-rearing roles.
Second, she advises, do it together. She reminds her friend that a father is as much a verb as a mother.
Parenting is an active choice and a shared labor, not a biologically predetermined gendered state of being.
Third, she says, teach her that the idea of gender roles is absolute nonsense. She is essentially hammering home Sartre's existentialist idea that existence precedes essence, translating high philosophy into parenting advice.
Adichie also offers some incredibly sharp cultural critiques that resonate deeply today. She explicitly warns her friend against the danger of what she calls feminism light.
This is the insidious idea of conditional equality, the belief that men are still naturally in charge, but they should benevolently allow women to have rights. Adichie rejects that entirely.
Furthermore, she urges her friend to teach her daughter to actively reject the burden of likability.
This is huge in modern social conditioning. Society constantly trains women to be agreeable, to smooth things over, to smile, and to be liked at all costs, often at the expense of their own boundaries.
Adichie writes, her job is not to make herself likable. Her job is to be her full self.
And finally, she tells her to deeply question our culture's selective use of biology as an excuse for social norms. It is a manifesto about raising a human being who is completely untethered from the historical baggage we spent this entire deep dive unpacking.
It is incredibly empowering, and it feels like the culmination of so many decades of struggle.
Yeah.
But interestingly, as we look at the modern landscape, the sources introduce a concept that complicates this narrative, called post-feminism.
This is a term used to describe a set of ideas that emerged late in the 20th century and gained traction in the early 2000s.
Post-feminism essentially suggests that the massive, collective systemic struggles of the first and second waves are largely over.
Post-feminist thinkers argue that the major goals like basic legal equality, voting rights, and access to education and the workplace have been achieved, and therefore it's time for the movement to evolve, or perhaps even disband.
Post-feminism marks a very significant shift in cultural tone. It moves the focus aggressively away from collective political action, systemic grievance, and analyzing patriarchal structures, and places the emphasis almost entirely on individual choice, consumerism, and personal empowerment.
A post-feminist perspective might argue that if a woman chooses to be a highly traditional stay-at-home mother, or if she chooses to enthusiastically participate in the beauty myth through extensive cosmetic surgery, or if she engages in sex work, those are all valid, unassailable expressions of her feminist empowerment, provided they are her free, individual choices.
It fundamentally rejects the essentialist notions of gender. But it also suggests that women's experiences and choices are now so hyper-individualized and diverse that a single, unified feminist movement fighting a common systemic enemy may no longer be necessary or even intellectually possible in the way it once was.
It's the girl power era ethos. If I choose it, it's feminist. Now, as we wrap up our analysis of this extensive body of research, we must address the final section of our source material.
And this is vital to providing you with a complete picture of the document we are studying. The overview we are looking at doesn't present these feminist theories in an uncontested vacuum.
Exactly. A truly comprehensive academic overview maps the entire territory, and that includes extensively mapping out the critiques, the counter-movements, and the traditionalist pushbacks against feminism.
That is a critical point. The document acknowledges that these feminist ideas have generated massive consequences in Western society, and they have faced, and continue to face, substantial, organized, intellectual, and religious critiques.
The source material specifically provides links, readings, and references to alternative frameworks that challenge the core metaphysical and social claims of feminism.
For example, it includes references to traditionalist readings titled God and Gender Roles, and articles examining the idea of traditional men and women.
Furthermore, it explicitly explores the social values of Islamic society and gender roles, providing links to resources from platforms like The Muslim Skeptic, which houses extensive libraries dedicated to critiquing Western feminism, specifically from a theological and Islamic perspective.
Yes, the research highlights that there are robust, active, and deeply held intellectual and religious traditions globally that fundamentally disagree with the existentialist premises we discussed at the very beginning.
These perspectives often argue forcefully for the spiritual, biological, or societal value of traditional complementary gender roles.
They argue that these roles are not oppressive constructs, but necessary frameworks rooted in theology, human biology, or the vital maintenance of social cohesion and family structure.
The sources acknowledge that these voices are a massive part of the broader global conversation, and our document maps this tension clearly. We are absolutely not taking a side here. We are simply examining the architecture of a worldview, and understanding the forces pushing against that architecture is just as important as understanding the structure itself.
It is the sign of a genuinely rigorous, critical overview. It recognizes and contextualizes its own opposition. And mapping that final piece of territory brings us to the end of our journey through this massive stack of research.
So, after unpacking all of this, what does this all mean? If we zoom all the way out, what have we actually learned from this deep dive?
We started with Charlotte Bunch's quote that feminism is a gestalt, a complete worldview. And I think we've seen exactly how true that is.
It is a vast, evolving, and sometimes contradictory philosophical framework. It starts way down in the bedrock of metaphysics, asking the biggest question possible. Who are we and what is our purpose?
It decides that we are free from inherent destiny. And from there, it systematically challenges how we define truth, how we measure morality, and how we write our laws.
It flows through history in these massive, distinct waves, fighting first for basic legal existence, then for cultural equality, and now for nuanced intersectional recognition in a digital age.
And we've seen how it branches into incredibly diverse schools of thought, from liberal feminists fighting in the corporate boardroom, to radical feminists fighting the cultural eroticization of violence, to Marxist feminists fighting the economic exploitation of motherhood, to womanists planting holistic gardens of community equality.
He is a profound, sprawling architecture of thought, and the reality is, whether one agrees with all of it, some of it, or absolutely none of it, understanding this framework is absolutely crucial for any informed citizen.
You simply cannot navigate modern society. You cannot understand our rapidly changing laws, our intense political divides, or our shifting cultural norms without understanding the mechanics of this specific worldview. It is the operating system running in the background of a massive portion of the modern world.
It truly is. You see its code in every headline and every debate.
You do. And as we conclude our deep dive today, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, a question inspired by everything we've unpacked.
What's the thought?
We spent a lot of time on that core feminist existentialist argument, Sartre's idea that existence precedes essence, the belief that we are entirely free to construct our own purpose because we are not bound by biological destiny. Yeah. My question to you is this: what happens to the concept of gender and this entire philosophical framework in the very near future? As we move rapidly into an era of incredibly advanced biotechnology, as we see the potential development of artificial wombs that divorce reproduction from the female body entirely, and as we gain the ability to live massive portions of our lives as digital formless avatars in virtual reality, will the physical biological body completely cease to be a factor in how we define ourselves? Or as we finally strip away all the biological imperatives, will we find that some underlying human essences are much harder to leave behind than the existentialist thought?
Oh, wow. Biology versus technology versus identity, that is a question that could launch an entirely new fifth wave of philosophy all on its own.
It really could.
That is definitely something for you to mull over on your commute or your next walk. Thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive. We love taking these incredibly complex stacks of information and breaking them down with you. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking for the machinery beneath the headlines, and we will see you on the next deep dive.